In the archives of Cornwall's coastal parishes, where salt has eaten through centuries of careful record-keeping, there exists a silence more profound than the winter gales that strip the gorse from Boscastle's cliffs. It is the silence that follows when 5 souls vanish between the pouring of tea and the lighting of evening lamps, leaving behind only the terrible evidence of interrupted domesticity. The chairs still held their warmth. The bread still waited, unbuttered. In this county where the sea claims what it will and the moors keep what they must, we have learned to ask fewer questions than we ought. Yet some absences demand witness, some disappearances require testimony. Here, in the fading light of a November afternoon in 1912, respectability itself became complicit in erasure, and an entire village learned the weight of collective blindness. The cottage on 4 Street maintained its vigil of ordinariness, even as darkness gathered around its stone walls, like a congregation of the guilty. Mrs. Tremaine, whose washing line commanded a view of every threshold in the lower village, had noted the precise moment when smoke ceased rising from the Penhallow chimney. 4:30, she would later testify, though her voice carried the tremor of one who wished she had observed less. The November afternoon had settled into that peculiar Cornish twilight, where sea mist and coal smoke conspired to blur the boundaries between the living world and whatever lay beyond the harbour mouth. Inside number 17, 5 chairs remained arranged around a table set for tea, each cup filled to the precise level that spoke of careful domestic ritual, each saucer aligned with the mathematical precision that Edith Penhallow brought to all her earthly duties. The bread knife lay beside an uncut loaf, its blade catching the last light from windows that would soon require the attention of neighbours brave enough to peer through glass that reflected more than it revealed. Harold Penhallow's pipe rested in its customary place beside his chair, the tobacco still warm enough to release its ghost of Virginia leaf into air that had grown thick with more than domestic smoke. His copy of the Royal Cornwall Gazette lay folded to the shipping news, as if he had been tracking the movement of vessels that might carry more than cargo between the known ports of the world. The children's school satchels hung from their hooks beside the door, arithmetic slates cleaned and ready for lessons that would never come, while their boots stood in the neat row that Edith insisted upon, each pair pointing toward a threshold they would never cross again. In the parlour beyond, the mantelpiece clock continued its faithful marking of time that had somehow become irrelevant, its brass pendulum catching reflections of a room where 5 lives had simply ceased to cast shadows. The very air seemed to hold its breath, as if the cottage itself had become complicit in whatever transformation had claimed its inhabitants between the ordinary moment of lifting teacups and the extraordinary silence that followed. The village of Boscastle had always understood the necessity of not seeing too much, not asking questions that might disturb the careful balance between respectability and the older truths that dwelt in the spaces between high tide and low. Mrs. Tremaine's testimony would prove both precise and deliberately incomplete, offering times and observations while carefully omitting the strange quality of light she had noticed around the Penhallow cottage in the hour before the smoke stopped rising. The other neighbours, when pressed by Constable Trelawney's gentle inquiries, would display a remarkable consistency in their failure to observe anything unusual, as if the entire street had been struck by a selective blindness that preserved their peace of mind, while abandoning the Penhallows to whatever fate had claimed them. This was the way of coastal communities, where survival often depended upon knowing when to look away, when to forget, when to allow the sea and the moors to keep their secrets without interference from those who valued their own continued existence above the demands of curiosity. Yet the cottage itself refused to cooperate with the village's collective amnesia, maintaining its evidence with the stubborn persistence of inanimate objects that had witnessed too much to remain silent. The fire in the grate had burned down to embers that still held warmth, suggesting a departure so recent that the very stones seemed to pulse with the memory of human presence. Edith's sewing basket sat beside her chair, needle threaded with blue wool, as if she had intended to return within moments, to continue mending young James's torn stocking. The children's toys remained scattered across the hearthrug, in patterns that spoke of interrupted play. Arthur's wooden soldiers arranged for a battle that would never be fought. Lily's doll seated at a miniature tea service that mirrored the larger tragedy unfolding around it. Every detail proclaimed the absolute ordinariness of the moment that had preceded the extraordinary, as if the Penhallows had been claimed not by any dramatic catastrophe, but by the simple act of existing too visibly in a place where visibility itself might prove dangerous. The kitchen bore witness to Edith's methodical preparations for the evening meal, potatoes peeled and waiting in their basin of cold water, the joint of mutton seasoned and ready for the oven that would never receive it. Her apron hung from its peg, still bearing the faint impressions of flour-dusted hands that had kneaded the morning's bread with the same careful attention she brought to all her domestic duties. The larder stood open, revealing shelves stocked with the provisions of a family that had planned for a future, extending well beyond the November afternoon that had claimed them. Jars of preserved fruit caught the dying light like amber windows into a summer that had passed, and a winter that would arrive without them. The very abundance of their preparations seemed to mock the completeness of their disappearance, as if the cottage had been transformed into a museum of interrupted intentions, a shrine to the terrible fragility of domestic happiness in a landscape that had never learned to distinguish between the innocent and the guilty. The silence that had settled over number 17 possessed a quality that seemed to seep through the walls and contaminate the very air of Fore Street, creating a zone of unease that the neighbours felt but could not name. Children who had played freely in the narrow lane now hurried past the cottage with downcast eyes, while their mothers found urgent errands that required them to take longer routes to the shops and the harbour. The postman, arriving the following morning with letters addressed to Harold Penhallow, would stand for long minutes before the door, his hand raised to knock on wood that seemed to have acquired the power to repel human contact. Even the gulls, those scavengers who feared nothing in their eternal quest for sustenance, avoided the cottage roof as if some invisible barrier had been erected between the building and the sky above. The Penhallow home had become a void in the fabric of village life, a place where the normal rhythms of existence had been interrupted by something that defied both explanation and acceptance. Constable Trelawney approached the Penhallow cottage with the measured tread of a man who had learned to balance duty against discretion in a county where both virtues could prove equally dangerous. His uniform, pressed and proper despite the November dampness that clung to every surface in Boscastle, seemed to absorb the strange quality of light that emanated from the cottage windows, as if the very fabric of authority could be contaminated by proximity to the inexplicable. The brass buttons that normally caught the sun with reassuring brightness appeared dulled, reflecting nothing but the grey uncertainty that had settled over Fore Street like a shroud woven from collective unease. His notebook, leather-bound and methodically organised, would record only those observations that could be safely committed to official memory, while the more troubling details would be relegated to the spaces between lines, the pauses between words, the careful omissions that preserved both sanity and employment. The village watched from behind curtains and half-open doors as their representative of law and order prepared to confront whatever had transformed the Penhallow home into a monument to interrupted existence. The front door yielded to his touch with the reluctance of wood that had absorbed more than moisture from the coastal air, creaking open to reveal the tableau that would haunt his dreams for the remainder of his days in service. The hallway stretched before him like a throat, waiting to swallow whatever courage he had mustered for this investigation, its familiar dimensions somehow altered by the weight of absence that pressed against every surface. Family photographs lined the walls in their neat frames, faces that smiled with the confidence of people who believed in their own permanence, their eyes seeming to track his movement with the accusatory persistence of the abandoned. The umbrella stand held Harold's walking stick and Edith's parasol, implements of ordinary life that had become relics of a world where afternoon strolls and protection from sun remained relevant concerns. Each step forward required a conscious effort of will, as if the cottage itself resisted his intrusion into its carefully preserved mystery, demanding that he acknowledge his own inadequacy before the magnitude of what had occurred within these walls. The sitting room presented its evidence with the pitiless clarity of a courtroom exhibit, each detail precisely arranged to demonstrate the impossibility of rational explanation. Constable Trelawney's trained eye catalogued the scene with mechanical precision, while his imagination recoiled from the implications of what he observed. 5 teacups, each containing liquid still warm enough to steam in the cool air, sat before chairs that retained the impressions of bodies that had occupied them mere hours before. The fire burned low but steady, suggesting that someone had tended it recently, yet no one remained to claim responsibility for this act of domestic maintenance. Young James's wooden horse lay on its side beside his chair, as if dropped by fingers suddenly required elsewhere, while Lily's embroidery hoop displayed 3 careful stitches in a pattern that would never be completed. The constable's notebook trembled slightly as he recorded these observations, his handwriting growing smaller and more cramped, as if the very act of documentation might somehow diminish the reality of what he witnessed. Arthur's schoolbooks lay open to a page of Latin conjugations, the ink still wet from a pen that had been abandoned mid-sentence, creating a trail of blue that seemed to point toward some invisible destination beyond the margins of comprehension. The boy's careful script proclaimed, "Amo amas amat," in the precise hand of a child who had been taught to value accuracy above all other virtues, yet the lesson remained forever incomplete, suspended in the amber of interrupted education. Constable Trelawney found himself staring at these unfinished words with an intensity that bordered on obsession, as if the secret of the family's disappearance might be hidden in the grammar of a dead language. The irony was not lost on him that a lesson about love should be the last earthly work of a boy who had vanished along with everything he had ever loved, leaving behind only the evidence of his diligent attention to duties that would never again require completion. Harold's chair bore the deepest impression, the leather worn smooth by years of evening reading and pipe smoking. Yet now it seemed to exhale something more than tobacco smoke, a presence that lingered despite the absence of its creator. His spectacles lay folded beside the Royal Cornwall Gazette, their lenses reflecting the dying light with the persistence of eyes that refused to close. The newspaper's shipping columns had been marked with pencil notations in Harold's careful hand, tracking the movements of vessels that plied the routes between Cornwall and destinations that existed beyond the boundaries of official maps. Constable Trelawney noted these markings with growing unease, recognizing in them the pattern of a man who had been expecting something, preparing for something, perhaps even arranging for something that required precise timing and absolute secrecy. The constable's duty demanded that he record these observations, yet his instinct for self-preservation whispered that some knowledge carried a price too high for any reasonable man to pay. Edith's chair retained the faint impression of her skirts and the lingering scent of the lavender water she favored, creating an olfactory ghost that seemed more real than the empty space she had left behind. Her sewing basket sat precisely where she had placed it, needle threaded and ready for the mending that would never be completed, while her thimble caught the light like a tiny silver beacon in the gathering darkness. The constable found himself reluctant to disturb these intimate remnants of domestic life, as if touching them might somehow complete whatever transformation had claimed their owner. Her prayer book lay open to a psalm about walking through the valley of the shadow of death, though whether this represented prophetic preparation or mere coincidence, he could not determine. The margin bore her neat annotations in pencil, observations about faith and endurance that seemed to mock the completeness of her disappearance. Constable Trelawney closed the book, with hands that shook slightly, adding it to the growing list of evidence that pointed toward preparation rather than surprise, complicity rather than victimization. The morning following Constable Trelawney's investigation brought with it a fog so dense that Boscastle seemed to exist in a world apart from the ordinary concerns of Cornwall, wrapped in grey silence that muffled both sound and conscience with equal efficiency. Mrs. Tremaine, whose washing line had provided the village's most reliable source of intelligence for the better part of 2 decades, found herself unable to hang her linens with the usual confidence, as if the very air had become contaminated by proximity to the inexplicable. Her neighbours emerged from their cottages, with the cautious movements of people who had discovered that their familiar world contained depths they had never suspected, depths that might claim the unwary, with the same casual efficiency that had swallowed the Penhallow family. The baker's shop opened late, the postman's rounds proceeded with unusual haste, and the fishermen who normally gathered at the harbour to discuss weather and catches spoke instead in whispers that carried no further than the fog that surrounded them. Boscastle had become a village of conspirators, united not by shared guilt, but by shared terror of what they might be required to know. The Methodist chapel, where the Penhallows had occupied the 3rd pew from the front every Sunday for the past 7 years, stood empty of their familiar presence, like a mouth missing its most prominent teeth. Reverend Pascoe, whose sermons had always emphasized the importance of bearing witness to truth, found himself struggling to meet the eyes of his congregation as they filed past the vacant pew with the elaborate casualness of people determined not to see what lay directly before them. His prepared sermon on the parable of the Good Samaritan seemed suddenly inappropriate, even dangerous, in a community that had collectively decided that some forms of neighborly concern carried risks too great to contemplate. The hymns rose with unusual fervor, as if volume might somehow drown out the questions that pressed against every throat, while the prayers for the missing family carried an undertone of desperation that suggested the congregation feared their petitions might be answered, in ways they could not bear to imagine. The chapel's ancient stones seemed to absorb these offerings of guilt and fear, adding them to the accumulated weight of centuries of similar compromises between faith and survival. Dr. Henwood, whose medical practice had served 3 generations of Boscastle families, discovered that his usual rounds now required careful navigation around the subject of the Penhallows, as if their disappearance had created a contagion that might spread through casual mention. His patients, normally eager to discuss the health and welfare of their neighbors, displayed a remarkable reluctance to acknowledge that the family had ever existed, referring to them only in the past tense, and with the sort of careful distance usually reserved for the recently deceased. When pressed for details about their last consultation, young James had suffered from a persistent cough that autumn. The doctor found his memory strangely clouded, as if some protective mechanism had activated to shield him from recollections that might prove too dangerous to retain. His medical bag, which had carried remedies for every ailment known to affect the human body, seemed suddenly inadequate to address the spiritual sickness that had infected his community, a malady that resisted both diagnosis and treatment. The harbour-master, whose logbooks recorded every vessel that entered or departed Boscastle's treacherous waters, displayed an unusual reluctance to discuss the shipping movements of the previous week, claiming that certain records had been damaged by the persistent dampness that plagued all coastal documentation. His assistant, normally voluble about the comings and goings of fishing boats and trading vessels, had developed a sudden stammer when questioned about any unusual activity around the time of the Penhallow's disappearance. The tide tables, usually consulted with religious devotion by every soul whose livelihood depended upon the sea's cooperation, seemed to have acquired gaps and inconsistencies that made precise timing impossible to determine. Even the lighthouse keeper, whose duty required him to maintain constant vigilance over the waters that surrounded their isolated community, claimed that fog had obscured his view during the crucial hours, though several villagers privately recalled that the evening had been unusually clear until well after sunset. Mrs. Polglace, who operated the village's only shop and therefore served as an unofficial repository for all local intelligence, found herself unable to recall the details of the Penhallow's final purchases, though her account books clearly showed transactions dated to the very day of their disappearance. Her memory, normally precise enough to recite the shopping habits of every family in the village, had developed selective gaps that seemed to expand whenever the conversation approached anything that might shed light on the family's fate. The other customers who had been present during those final transactions displayed a similar amnesia, as if the entire community had been struck by a collective forgetting that preserved their peace of mind while abandoning the missing family to whatever. Darkness had claimed them. The shop's bell, which had announced every arrival and departure for the past 30 years, seemed to ring with a different tone now, as if even inanimate objects had been altered by their proximity to the inexplicable. The children of Boscastle, who normally served as the village's most reliable source of unfiltered observation, had been struck by an unusual reticence that their parents encouraged with a fervor that bordered on desperation. Arthur's classmates, when questioned about their missing friend, displayed a remarkable inability to recall anything significant about his behavior or conversation in the days preceding his disappearance. Lily's playmates had apparently forgotten the games they had shared and the secrets they had whispered, while young James's absence from the infant class seemed to have created no noticeable disruption in the daily routine. The schoolmaster, whose duty required him to maintain accurate attendance records, discovered that his register for the relevant period had suffered water damage that rendered several entries illegible, though he could not recall any incident that might have caused such selective destruction. The playground, where the Penhallow children had played with the innocent enthusiasm of youth, now echoed with a silence that seemed to infect even the most boisterous games, as if joy itself had become suspect in a world where families could simply cease to exist between tea time and sunset. The organized search for the Penhallow family commenced at dawn on the third day following their disappearance, though the volunteers who assembled in the village square moved with the reluctant efficiency of people fulfilling an obligation they hoped would prove fruitless. Constable Trelawney had requested assistance from the neighbouring parishes, and men arrived from Tintagel and Camelford carrying ropes and lanterns, their faces bearing the grim determination of those who understood that some searches were undertaken not in hope of discovery, but in service to the appearance of proper concern. The moors above Boscastle stretched away into the November mist like a grey ocean that had swallowed countless souls over the centuries, while the coastal paths wound along cliffs that had claimed their share of the unwary and the desperate. Each searcher carried the unspoken knowledge that Cornwall's landscape possessed an appetite for human tragedy that could never be fully satisfied, and that their efforts might serve only to feed that hunger with fresh offerings of hope and despair. The search parties divided according to a logic that seemed designed more to distribute guilt than to maximize efficiency, with each group assigned to territories that offered equal measures of possibility and peril. The coastal team, led by Harbour Master Tregenna, would follow the cliff paths where a family might have walked to admire the sunset, and found themselves claimed by the treacherous footing that had betrayed so many before them. The moor party, under the reluctant guidance of Farmer Nan Carrow, would traverse the inland routes where ancient stone circles and abandoned mine shafts created a landscape honeycombed with opportunities for disappearance. The village team, perhaps the most reluctant of all, would conduct a house-to-house search that everyone understood, would reveal nothing more than the community's collective determination to avoid discovering anything that might disturb their carefully maintained ignorance. Each group carried whistles to signal discovery, though the shrill notes that occasionally pierced the morning air proved to herald nothing more significant than false alarms and nervous exhaustion. The coastal search revealed evidence that seemed designed to tantalize rather than illuminate, offering fragments of possibility that dissolved under closer examination like morning mist touched by sunlight. A child's hair ribbon, caught on a gorse bush near the cliff edge, proved to belong to the vicar's daughter rather than young Lily Penhallow, though the discovery prompted 20 minutes of frantic searching among the rocks below before this disappointing truth emerged. Harold's walking stick was found propped against a stone wall half a mile from the village, positioned with such deliberate care that it seemed more like a message than an accident. Yet no other trace of the family could be discovered, despite hours of methodical searching through every cave and crevice that might have concealed human remains. The searchers found themselves increasingly reluctant to peer too closely into the darker recesses of the coastline, as if some instinct warned them that certain discoveries might prove more dangerous than ignorance. Farmer Nan Carrow's party encountered their own collection of false leads and troubling absences, discovering signs of recent human passage that seemed to lead nowhere and end in nothing. Footprints in the soft earth near Roughtor appeared to match the size and pattern of Harold's boots, yet they terminated abruptly at a patch of bare stone that offered no further clues to their maker's destination. A section of Edith's blue dress was found snagged on a hawthorn bush, though the fabric showed no signs of the violent tearing that might be expected if she had passed that way in distress or haste. The children's voices seemed to echo from the ancient stone circles that dotted the moorland, yet when the searchers approached these monuments to investigate, they found only the wind moving through gaps in the granite that had been carved by hands that had turned to dust millennia before the Penhallows had drawn their first breath. The moors, it seemed, were determined to offer just enough evidence to maintain hope, while providing nothing substantial enough to support either rescue or resignation. The village search proved the most frustrating of all, as residents who had lived cheek by jowl for generations suddenly discovered that they knew remarkably little about their neighbours' habits, routines, or possible destinations. Outbuildings that had stood empty for years were found to contain fresh signs of occupation, a warm blanket, recently used candles, provisions that had not been there the previous week, yet no one could explain how these items had arrived or who might have placed them there. The old smugglers' tunnels that honeycombed the area beneath the village had apparently been sealed for decades, yet several searchers reported hearing voices echoing from depths that should have contained nothing but rats and memories. Mrs. Tremain's certainty about the timing of the Penhallows' disappearance began to waver under questioning, as she discovered that her usually reliable memory had developed gaps and inconsistencies that seemed to expand with each attempt to pin down precise details. By afternoon, the search had devolved into a series of increasingly desperate forays into territories that everyone understood were unlikely to yield results, as if the very act of looking had become more important than the possibility of finding. The searchers moved with the mechanical persistence of people fulfilling a ritual whose meaning had been forgotten, but whose completion remained essential to their spiritual survival. Constable Trelawney found himself coordinating efforts that seemed designed to exhaust every possibility while discovering nothing, as if the landscape itself had conspired to swallow not only the Penhallow family, but any evidence that might explain their fate. The whistles fell silent as the November afternoon faded into evening, and the searchers returned to the village square with empty hands and expressions that suggested they had found exactly what they had expected to find, nothing that could disturb the careful balance between duty and self-preservation that governed life in a community where some questions were too dangerous to answer. The official report that Constable Trelawney would eventually file with his superiors in Bodmin would record a thorough search, conducted under challenging conditions, with no evidence discovered to suggest foul play or to indicate the family's likely fate. The volunteers would return to their homes and their ordinary concerns, carrying with them the satisfaction of duty performed and the relief of obligations fulfilled without consequence. Yet something had changed in the very air of Boscastle, a subtle alteration in the quality of light and shadow that suggested the village had been marked by its encounter with the inexplicable. The Penhallow cottage would remain empty, its windows reflecting nothing but the grey sky that seemed to press down upon the community with the weight of unanswered questions and unacknowledged guilt. The cottage stood as they had left it, yet everything within bore the peculiar quality of abandonment that settles upon a place within hours of desertion. Mrs. Tremaine, the village postmistress, had been the first to notice the accumulation of letters beneath the door, their edges curling with the damp that seeped through the stone threshold. She spoke of it later, with the careful precision of one who understood that her words would be weighed and measured by those who came after. The Morning Post had included a letter from Harold's brother in Plymouth, inquiring about the family's planned visit for Christmas, and a notice from the parish council regarding the upcoming harvest festival. These mundane communications, arriving to an empty house, carried a weight that no one could have anticipated when they were first penned. The irony was not lost on those who examined them later. Correspondence about future gatherings, addressed to those who had already passed beyond the reach of any earthly reunion. Inspector Blackwood arrived on the third day, his presence marking the official acknowledgement that this was no longer a matter of local concern, but something that required the attention of those trained in the darker mysteries of human disappearance. He was a man shaped by years of investigating the inexplicable, his weathered face bearing the lines that come from too many sleepless nights spent pondering the spaces between what was known and what could never be proven. His examination of the cottage was methodical, almost ritualistic in its thoroughness. He noted the placement of each teacup, the precise angle at which Harold's newspaper had been folded, the way Edith's sewing basket sat with its contents arranged as if she had merely stepped away for a moment. The children's toys remained scattered across the parlour floor in patterns that spoke of interrupted play, their wooden horses and cloth dolls bearing witness to games that would never be completed. Each detail was recorded with the careful attention of one who understood that in cases such as these, significance often lay hidden in the most ordinary of objects. The inspector's interviews with the villagers revealed a community caught between genuine concern and an almost palpable desire to distance themselves from whatever had befallen the Penhallow family. Mrs. Cavendish, who lived in the cottage nearest to theirs, spoke of hearing the children's laughter that final afternoon, their voices carrying across the garden wall as they played some elaborate game involving pirates and treasure. She remembered thinking how pleasant it was to hear such joy, how it reminded her of her own children's voices from decades past. Yet when pressed for more specific details, her recollections became vague, uncertain. She could not say precisely when the laughter had stopped, could not recall hearing any sounds of distress or alarm. It was as if the family had simply faded from existence as gradually and naturally as daylight fades into dusk. The inspector noted this pattern in interview after interview, clear memories of normal activity followed by an inexplicable void, as if the very act of the family's disappearance had somehow erased itself from the collective memory of those who might have witnessed it. Dr. Cornelius Ashworth, the village physician, provided what little medical insight could be gleaned from the physical evidence left behind. He examined the cottage with the clinical detachment of one accustomed to reading the stories that bodies and belongings tell, yet even his trained eye could find no indication of violence, struggle, or sudden illness. The beds showed no signs of disturbance beyond normal use. The kitchen contained no evidence of spoiled food or interrupted meal preparation, and the family's clothing remained neatly arranged in wardrobes and drawers. Most puzzling of all was the complete absence of any personal items that might suggest hasty departure. Harold's pocket watch remained on the bedside table, Edith's jewelry box sat undisturbed on her dressing table, and the children's most treasured possessions lay exactly where they would be expected. Dr. Ashworth's report, filed with the county authorities, concluded with the reluctant admission that medical science could offer no explanation for what had occurred. The family had simply ceased to exist within their home, leaving behind no trace of their passage from presence to absence. The local constable, Thomas Penrose, had known the Penhallow family for the better part of a decade, had watched the children grow from infants to the bright, curious youngsters they had become. His investigation was hampered not by lack of cooperation from the villagers, but by the strange uniformity of their accounts. Everyone had seen the family that final day. Everyone could attest to their apparent normalcy. Yet no one could provide any detail that might explain their subsequent disappearance. Penrose walked the coastal paths they were known to frequent, searched the abandoned mine shafts that dotted the surrounding countryside, and questioned every soul who might have encountered them in their final hours. His efforts yielded nothing but the growing certainty that whatever had befallen the Penhallows was beyond the scope of conventional investigation. The constable's final report, written in his careful, deliberate hand, spoke of a family who had lived quietly and vanished completely, leaving behind only questions that seemed to multiply with each attempt to answer them. The cottage itself began to acquire a reputation that extended far beyond the boundaries of Boscastle, drawing visitors whose interest in the case bordered on the morbid. Journalists arrived from London and Plymouth, their notebooks filled with theories that ranged from the plausible to the fantastic, yet none could explain the fundamental mystery of how 5 people could simply cease to exist without leaving any trace of their departure. The local authorities, overwhelmed by the attention and frustrated by their inability to provide answers, eventually sealed the cottage and declared the case officially suspended pending new evidence. Yet the building continued to exert its strange fascination, standing empty and silent while the seasons turned around it, its windows reflecting the changing sky like eyes that had seen too much and could never speak of what they had witnessed. The Penhallow cottage had become more than a crime scene. It had become a monument to the inexplicable, a reminder that even in an age of scientific advancement and rational inquiry, some mysteries remained forever beyond human understanding. The months that followed the official suspension of the investigation brought a different kind of attention to the Penhallow case, as scholars and researchers arrived to examine what had become known in academic circles as the Boscastle phenomenon. Professor Edmund Hartwell of Oxford University, a specialist in unexplained disappearances throughout British history, established a temporary research station in the village inn, his presence marking the transformation of a local tragedy into a subject of scholarly inquiry. His approach was methodical and dispassionate, treating the cottage and its contents as archaeological artifacts that might yield their secrets to careful analysis. He catalogued every item left behind, photographed every room from multiple angles, and interviewed villagers with the patience of one accustomed to extracting meaning from fragmentary evidence. Yet for all his scientific rigor, Professor Hartwell found himself confronting the same fundamental impossibility that had stymied the police investigation: the complete absence of any logical explanation for how 5 people could vanish so thoroughly from a locked cottage in broad daylight. The professor's research revealed that the Penhallow disappearance was not entirely without precedent in the region's history. Parish records dating back to the 16th century contained scattered references to similar vanishings, always involving entire families, always occurring without warning or explanation. In 1847, the Trevelyan family of nearby Tintagel had disappeared under remarkably similar circumstances, leaving behind a cottage filled with the detritus of interrupted daily life. Before that, in 1793, the Roscarrock family had vanished from their farm near Camelford, their absence discovered only when neighbours noticed that their livestock had been left unattended for several days. Each case shared the same inexplicable characteristics: no signs of struggle, no evidence of departure, no witnesses to anything unusual. Professor Hartwell's compilation of these historical incidents revealed a pattern that stretched back centuries, suggesting that whatever had claimed the Penhallows was part of something far older and more persistent than anyone had previously imagined. The academic community received his findings with a mixture of fascination and skepticism, unable to dismiss the evidence yet unwilling to accept its implications. The cottage itself began to show signs of the peculiar decay that seems to afflict buildings touched by unexplained tragedy. Despite being structurally sound and well-maintained at the time of the family's disappearance, it developed a persistent dampness that no amount of heating could dispel, and a subtle but unmistakable odor that visitors described as reminiscent of sea air mixed with something indefinably organic. The wallpaper in the parlour began to peel in patterns that seemed almost deliberate, revealing patches of older decoration beneath, faded roses and ivy that spoke of previous occupants and earlier lives. Windows that had been crystal clear became clouded with a film that resisted all attempts at cleaning, and floorboards that had never creaked before began to emit soft groans and sighs at odd hours of the day and night. Local workmen, hired to maintain the property in its sealed state, reported an increasing reluctance to enter the building, citing an atmosphere of oppressive melancholy that seemed to intensify with each passing month. The cottage was transforming itself into something that reflected its tragic history, becoming a physical manifestation of the mystery it contained. Mrs. Edith Penhallow's sister, Margaret Thornfield, arrived from London 6 months after the disappearance, determined to claim her sister's belongings and perhaps find some clue that the official investigation had overlooked. Her visit to the cottage was brief but profoundly disturbing, as she later recounted to anyone willing to listen. She spoke of entering rooms that felt simultaneously familiar and alien, of recognizing her sister's handwriting in shopping lists and diary entries while feeling as if she were reading the words of a stranger. Most unsettling of all was her discovery of a letter that Edith had apparently begun writing to her on the very day of the disappearance. A cheerful note about the children's progress in school and plans for the upcoming Christmas season. He abandoned mid-sentence, as if the writer had simply ceased to exist while forming the words. Margaret's attempt to spend a single night in the cottage ended in failure, as she found herself overwhelmed by a sense of presence that was somehow more disturbing than any feeling of emptiness would have been. She left the following morning, taking only a few small mementos and leaving behind a written statement that the cottage should remain sealed indefinitely. The children's schoolmaster, Mr. Aldrich Pemberton, provided perhaps the most poignant testimony about the family's final days. He spoke of Arthur, Lily and James as exceptional students, bright and curious children who had shown no signs of distress or unusual behavior in the weeks leading up to their disappearance. Arthur had been particularly excited about a history project on local legends, spending hours in the village library researching stories of ancient Cornwall. Lily had been rehearsing for the Christmas pageant, her clear soprano voice bringing tears to the eyes of those who heard her practice. Young James had recently learned to read and was working his way through a collection of fairy tales with the determined concentration of a child discovering the magic of written words. Mr. Pemberton's records showed perfect attendance for all 3 children, right up until the day they vanished, with no indication that anything was amiss in their home life. His final entry in the school register, noting their unexplained absence, was written in a hand that trembled with emotion, a teacher's grief for students who would never return to complete their lessons. The village itself began to change in subtle but unmistakable ways following the Penhallow disappearance, as if the loss of one family had somehow altered the fundamental character of the community. Conversations became more guarded, laughter less frequent, and the easy familiarity that had characterized relationships between neighbors gave way to a cautious reserve. Children were kept closer to home, their parents suddenly aware of dangers they could not name, but somehow felt in their bones. The annual Harvest Festival, traditionally a celebration of community solidarity, was subdued that year, marked by an undercurrent of unease, that no amount of forced merriment could dispel. Even the landscape seemed affected, as visitors noted that the coastal paths the Penhallows had loved to walk appeared somehow less inviting, the views they had admired now carrying an undertone of melancholy that had not been present before. Boscastle was learning to live with the weight of an unsolved mystery, discovering that some absences leave scars that never fully heal. As the first anniversary of the disappearance approached, the village of Boscastle found itself caught between the desire to commemorate the lost family and an equally strong impulse to let their memory fade into the comfortable obscurity of forgotten tragedy. The local vicar, Reverend Septimus Blackthorne, struggled with the theological implications of holding a memorial service for people whose fate remained unknown, whose souls might still be wandering in some liminal space between life and death. His sermons during this period took on a quality of desperate searching, as he attempted to find meaning in meaninglessness, to offer comfort in the face of incomprehensible loss. The congregation listened with the polite attention of people who had heard too many explanations that explained nothing, their faces bearing the resigned expression of those who had learned to live with questions that had no answers. Reverend Blackthorne's private journals, discovered years later, revealed a man tormented by doubt, questioning not only his ability to provide spiritual guidance, but the very foundations of faith itself, when confronted with such inexplicable suffering. The cottage had by this time acquired a reputation that extended far beyond Cornwall, drawing spiritualists, occultists, and curiosity seekers from across Britain and beyond. These visitors came seeking evidence of supernatural intervention, hoping to find in the Penhallow case confirmation of their various theories about life after death, parallel dimensions, or other-worldly abduction. Their investigations yielded nothing but frustration, as the cottage stubbornly refused to provide the dramatic manifestations they sought. No ghostly apparitions materialized, no mysterious sounds echoed through the empty rooms, no psychic impressions revealed the family's fate. The building remained resolutely mundane in its mystery, offering only the maddening silence of unanswered questions. Local opinion of these visitors ranged from tolerant amusement to outright hostility, as villagers grew weary of having their tragedy transformed into entertainment for those who had never known the Penhallows as living, breathing human beings rather than subjects of supernatural speculation. Dr. Ashworth's medical practice began to reflect the psychological toll that the unsolved disappearance was taking on the community. He treated an increasing number of patients for ailments that seemed to have no physical cause: insomnia, nervous exhaustion, and a peculiar form of melancholia that he privately termed proximity grief, the sorrow felt by those who had lived alongside tragedy without being directly touched by it. Children, in particular, seemed affected by the absence of their former playmates, developing fears and anxieties that their parents struggled to address. How does one explain to a 6-year-old that sometimes people simply vanish without reason or warning? How does one provide reassurance when the very foundations of security have been shaken by the demonstration that safety is an illusion and permanence a lie? Dr. Ashworth's case notes from this period read like a catalogue of a community's slow psychological disintegration, each individual patient representing another small fracture in the collective spirit of Boscastle. The local newspaper, the North Cornwall Gazette, found itself in the peculiar position of being unable to let the story die while having nothing new to report about it. Editor James Trelawney published a series of retrospective articles on the anniversary, interviewing villagers about their memories of the family and their theories about what might have happened. These pieces revealed the extent to which the Penhallow disappearance had become woven into the fabric of local identity, a defining event that colored every subsequent occurrence in the village. Births and deaths, marriages and departures, all were now measured against the standard of that inexplicable loss, as if the vanishing of one family had somehow altered the fundamental nature of existence in Boscastle. Trelawney's editorial on the anniversary concluded with a paragraph that captured the community's exhausted bewilderment. We have learned to live with mystery as our neighbor, to accept that some questions will forever remain unanswered, and to find what peace we can in the knowledge that love persists even when its objects have passed beyond our understanding. Professor Hartwell's academic study of the case had by this time evolved into something approaching obsession, as he found himself unable to abandon a mystery that seemed to mock every attempt at rational explanation. His research had expanded to include similar disappearances throughout Europe and beyond, revealing a pattern of vanishings that stretched across centuries and continents. Yet for all his scholarly investigation, he remained no closer to understanding what had happened to the Penhallows than he had been on the day he first arrived in Boscastle. His colleagues at Oxford began to express concern about his mental state, noting that his lectures had taken on an increasingly frantic quality, as if he were trying to convince himself as much as his students that rational inquiry could eventually triumph over inexplicable mystery. His final paper on the subject, published in the Journal of Anomalous Phenomena, concluded with an admission that would have been unthinkable from such a rigorous academic mind just 2 years earlier. Some mysteries may be intended to remain unsolved, serving as reminders of the limits of human understanding and the persistence of forces beyond our comprehension. The anniversary itself passed quietly, marked only by a small gathering at the village church, where those who had known the family came to share memories and offer prayers for souls whose location remained unknown. Mrs. Cavendish spoke of Edith's kindness, her willingness to help neighbours in times of need, her gentle way with children who were not her own. The schoolmaster remembered Arthur's curiosity, Lily's sweet voice, James's infectious laughter. Harold was recalled as a steady, reliable man who had worked hard to provide for his family and had never spoken an unkind word about anyone. These testimonies painted a picture of ordinary people living ordinary lives, making their inexplicable disappearance all the more disturbing. As the service concluded and the congregation dispersed into the gathering dusk, each person carried with them the weight of unanswered questions and the uncomfortable knowledge that the same fate that had claimed the Penhallows could, without warning or explanation, claim any of them. The cottage stood empty in the distance, its windows reflecting the last light of day like eyes that had seen too much and would never speak of what they had witnessed. 10 years have passed since the Penhallow family vanished between tea time and sunset, and the cottage that once housed their laughter and dreams has become something else entirely, a monument to the inexplicable, a shrine to questions that refuse to yield their answers to the persistent inquiry of human reason. The building itself has aged in ways that seem to defy the normal passage of time, its stone walls bearing the patina of centuries rather than decades, its windows clouded with a film that no amount of cleaning can remove. Visitors who brave the overgrown garden path speak of an atmosphere that presses against them like a physical weight, a sense of presence that is somehow more disturbing than any absence could be. The cottage has become a repository of memory and mystery, holding within its silent rooms the echo of lives that ended without explanation and the persistent question of what force could remove an entire family from existence without leaving so much as a footprint in the garden soil. The village of Boscastle has learned to live with its burden of unanswered questions, developing the peculiar resilience that comes to communities touched by inexplicable tragedy. New families have moved into the area, drawn by the rugged beauty of the Cornish coast and the relative affordability of property in a place marked by mystery. These newcomers bring fresh perspectives and untainted memories, yet they too find themselves gradually drawn into the web of speculation and unease that surrounds the Penhallow case. Children born after the disappearance grow up hearing whispered stories of the family that vanished, their young minds struggling to comprehend how 5 people could simply cease to exist without warning or explanation. The cottage has become part of local folklore, a cautionary tale told to children who venture too far from home, a reminder that the world contains forces beyond human understanding or control. Dr. Ashworth, now in his 70s, continues his practice with the weary dedication of a man who has seen too much of human suffering to maintain any illusions about the fundamental fairness of existence. His medical journals from the past decade reveal a gradual shift in his understanding of the case, from scientific puzzlement to something approaching philosophical acceptance. He has come to view the Penhallow disappearance not as a problem to be solved, but as a mystery to be endured, a reminder of the limits of human knowledge and the persistence of forces that operate beyond the reach of rational inquiry. His final written thoughts on the matter, penned just last month, conclude with a passage that captures the essence of a decade's worth of fruitless speculation. Perhaps some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved, serving as humbling reminders that for all our scientific advancement and rational inquiry, We remain children stumbling through a universe far stranger and more complex than our limited understanding can encompass. The academic community has largely moved on from the Penhallow case, filing it away in the category of unsolved mysteries that periodically surface in journals devoted to anomalous phenomena but generate little serious scholarly interest. Professor Hartwell's obsession with the case ultimately cost him his position at Oxford, as colleagues grew concerned about his mental stability and his increasingly erratic behavior. He spent his final years living in a small cottage near Boscastle, continuing his research into unexplained disappearances with the desperate intensity of a man who had staked his entire worldview on finding a rational explanation for the inexplicable. His death 3 years ago was attributed to heart failure, but those who knew him best understood that he had died of frustration, worn down by the relentless pursuit of answers that refused to reveal themselves. His papers, donated to the university library, fill 17 boxes with meticulous documentation of cases that share only one common characteristic: their complete resistance to logical explanation. Mrs. Cavendish, now the village's unofficial keeper of the Penhallow memory, has watched a generation of children grow up in the shadow of the mystery, their young lives shaped by the knowledge that safety is an illusion and permanence a lie. She speaks of the family with the reverence reserved for saints or martyrs, as if their inexplicable fate has somehow sanctified their memory and elevated them beyond the reach of ordinary human judgment. Her cottage, the one nearest to the Penhallow property, has become an informal museum of sorts filled with photographs and mementos that she has collected over the years. Visitors seeking information about the case inevitably find their way to her door, drawn by her reputation as the last person to hear the children's laughter on that final afternoon. She receives them with the patient courtesy of one who has told the same story countless times, yet her eyes hold the haunted quality of someone who has witnessed something beyond human comprehension and has never quite recovered from the experience. The cottage itself stands as the final witness to a mystery that has outlasted all attempts at explanation, its empty rooms holding secrets that may never be revealed to human understanding. The garden has returned to wildness, overrun with brambles and weeds that seem to grow with unusual vigor, as if fed by some hidden source of nourishment. Local children dare each other to approach the building on Halloween nights, their young voices carrying across the moors as they flee in delighted terror from shadows that may or may not be products of their imagination. The windows, clouded with that persistent film that defies all cleaning, reflect the changing seasons like eyes that have seen too much and can never speak of what they have witnessed. Inside, the 5 chairs still sit around the dining table, their seats bearing the faint impressions of bodies that once occupied them, their arrangement unchanged since that final tea time when a family gathered for the last time before passing beyond the reach of human understanding into whatever realm claims. Those who vanish without explanation, leaving behind only questions that echo through the years like voices, calling from a great distance, forever seeking answers that will never come.